to the European theater and the European side of the war that the United States gets involved in. Again, Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941. And as that war declaration goes out, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, it was read to a U.S. diplomat in Germany who had to relay the message to Franklin Roosevelt. This is kind of seen as a shock that Germany would declare war on us because this is going to be uh, something else that spells doom for Hitler because now he's going to be overwhelmed by the Americans forming an alliance with the British and the French, as well as the Soviet Union, okay, who has joined in the war as well. And I haven't mentioned that yet, but the Allied powers on this one are going to be the same as they were in World War One, with the addition of the Soviet Union, who is not off fighting their civil war at that point in time. But the other thing that you need to keep in mind on this is, like I said, with that diplomat reading the Declaration of War, he basically said that if your president wants war, then he will get war, and then he turned around and walked out. And we're going, okay, I guess we're fighting a war on two fronts now. So anyway, we had to prepare for a while for war in Europe, and as we were preparing for war in Europe, we use a heavy network of spies. Several of them are killed or injured in attempting to gather information on the Germany. But again, we did have our allies, Britain and France, working with us on this, and we wound up capturing a German Enigma machine, which I believe worked. You could type in a message on that, and the buttons you pushed would hit different buttons and type in something, so it came out as a bunch of gibberish, and you'd have to have a teletype or a Enigma machine in order to fully understand what was being said in this message. Well, we captured one, so now we're able to decode messages that were being relayed on paper between the Nazis or the Germans. Okay, and we also, in using this allowed us to find a pack of U-boats that were sitting in the Pacific Ocean, or sorry, sitting in the Atlantic Ocean, that could have caused significant damage to Allied ships over there. But we were able to thwart this by knowing where those boats are going to be at that point in time. And in doing so, this is part of what we call the Battle of the Atlantic, in which the Atlantic Ocean, there was some fighting out on the Atlantic Ocean, not nearly as severe as the Pacific, but there's fighting over that to secure trade routes and secure passenger routes, so on and so forth. And it takes until 1943 for the Allies to overcome the German U-boat presence to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Mentioned before the number of U-boats that were out on the Atlantic Ocean. There was actually one U-boat that managed to drive all the way into New York City and could have potentially shot a few torpedoes or bombed people over there, but that sort of damage was avoided. Okay, now we have to use new tactics in order to defeat the Germans, and we have to use new weapons and new technologies in order to defeat the Germans. We utilize radar, just the same way the British did, to detect locations of German planes. We also use radars in order to understand where these planes were taking off from over in Germany. And we also, instead of just bombing at night, we decided that bombing in daylight would probably be a little more accurate. So we had these onboard computers, which you could put in coordinates of where, like, weapons factories or vehicle factories might be. And as planes are flying over these, they could zero in basically on where bombs are supposed to be dropped. And these bombers are flying now at high altitudes. The pilots have to have oxygen, so it's not like World War I where you're just flying around at low altitude and can still breathe. But these high altitude bombing runs during daylight allow us to destroy a lot of German necessary infrastructure that they needed to win the war. And basically set a new tactic in utilizing bombers throughout the rest of the war. We also wind up relying on the Soviet Union in order to help win this war. They wind up having a war on two fronts with Germany, and eventually it's going to be a war on three fronts. But the Soviet Unions are going to employ scorched earth tactics against Germany. They are invaded, of course, in 1940. But Hitler decided to invade in September of 1940 or 1941, which is the same time Napoleon Bonaparte tried to invade Russia. And both men encountered scorched earth, in which the Russians had basically torched everything of value to their war cause. They had taken away all the food, moved all the people into the cities, and the Russians were basically willing to suffer and go without as long as Germany was not able to take them over. Russians are going to die in masses as a result of World War II. This is in addition to Stalin's purges that killed 40 million, but another 20 million, I believe, are going to be dead by the end of the Second World War from other causes. Okay, they are going to plead with the United States for help in opening a second European front. Like I said, the British and the French have been fighting on one, but now the Americans are going to come in, and we are going to wind up fighting on another front. Okay, so the way we get involved in the war in Europe, we do not immediately go into France. Okay, we decided that we need to come from the south up and invade there, and then we would eventually meet up with the Soviet Union as they came in from the east. Okay, now the guy that came up with this was Winston Churchill, the same guy that said that Neville Chamberlain of Britain was appeasing Hitler by giving him all this land and Austria and Czechoslovakia. So Winston Churchill is going to propose that we need to hit Germany in their underbelly, which basically means we go through northern Africa, where the Germans at that point in time were already attacking, and go into Italy, which is Germany's ally, and attack from there. Okay, as mentioned before, Germany is already in Africa with a guy named Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Okay, and his nickname was the Desert Fox. He was very skilled in tank warfare, and he was down there trying to take the Suez Canal for Germany. And the goal of this was to have a purely water route from the Mediterranean, where Italy is, all the way to the Indian and Pacific Ocean. Because if you capture the Suez Canal, going down through the Nile River, you're able to link up with those two oceans over there. Okay. Now, the only reason why I put Rommel's picture on here, he was of the Nazi Party, but he did not support the Holocaust. And as a matter of fact, may have been involved in a plot to kill Hitler at one point in time. And Rommel actually was forced to commit suicide, but buried with full military honors, as he was never tried for that potential murder of Hitler. Okay, and again, there was several conspiracies to kill Hitler. You probably are most familiar with Operation Valkyrie, which a bomb exploded nearby Hitler and almost killed him, but an attempt to decapitate the government of Germany. But there was another one that Rommel was involved in shortly before that one. But like I said, anyway, I don't include too many pictures of the enemy in here just because they don't deserve the recognition. Okay. Now, another person of note during this era that you probably want to keep in mind, because we're going to talk about him significantly in the next couple of units, but this is Dwight D. Eisenhower, a general from Abilene, Kansas, which is a small central Kansas town. He led an attack on northern Africa in November of 1942, met Rommel's forces head on, but was able to force Germany out of that area by May of 1943. Whenever we declare victory in northern Africa and force them back up across the Mediterranean Sea, this allows Roosevelt and Churchill to meet and state that they wanted the unconditional surrender of Germany. In other words, we are not going to stop this war until Germany completely surrenders. Instead of playing to a draw or anything like that, we wanted Hitler to surrender. And with Hitler surrendering, we wanted to capture him, and Churchill in particular wanted a very severe punishment for him that called for Hitler to be put in an electric chair and the broadcast of his execution to go worldwide. Okay, so anyway, the attack from the south over in Europe is going to continue as the Allies reached Italy across the Mediterranean Sea. Once they get into Italy, they're going to see some fierce fighting there. But Italy, as they are coming up through Italy, they're going to be forced to surrender in 1943 in terms of their government surrendering, and they're going to switch sides, the same way they did during World War I. But as Italy is forced to surrender, there is still going to be some very fierce fighting going on in the islands south of Italy and in Italy itself. Okay, this is as a result of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini and forces loyal to him. Again, this guy had come into power within within Italy, and had taken over based off the fact that he made people afraid of communism. And he said under him and his private army that there would never be a worry about communism within Italy, so he was able to employ fascism there very quickly. Now, Benito Mussolini, however, whenever Italy surrenders in 1943, shortly after that, he is captured. He winds up being murdered along with his wife. However, They dumped the bodies of Mussolini and his wife, as well as a very close right-hand man, in a town square someplace in Italy. People go out in the town square one night and notice these two bodies, and they notice that it is Mussolini. Mussolini, uh, for lack of a better term, they basically made him into a human pinata. They strung him up around a tree and they beat him severely, even though he's already dead. They disfigured his face, mutilated other parts of him, uh, along with his wife. There are pictures depicted of this online that I've not put in here because they're so graphic. Basically, his face wound up looking like a if you had silly putty that had been made into a human face. It had been smashed in. It was very just graphic and brutal. But in seeing the photos of this, Hitler is going to see this and his former ally and how he was brutally murdered. And he says he will never be captured alive. Okay, and he will never be captured if he is dead. Okay, which you may be going, what in the world about that? He then at that point in time decides that if he was going to be overrun, that his body was going to be ordered to be destroyed through some means of burning or taken out to sea and buried there. So we'll talk more about that later on. But the attack on Italy continued even after the surrender of Mussolini and his government until Rome actually fell on June 4th, 1944. German soldiers just absolutely refused to give up Italy, knowing that if Italy fell, then Germany was probably going to come next. Okay, so June 4th, 1944, Italy is going to fall to the Allies, and that date is pretty significant because there's going to be some other developments in Europe at that point in time. Okay, more on that here in just a second. But backtracking a little bit, so that way I can set you up for what happens 2 days after Italy falls. In Tehran, Winston Churchill, just going over him in another class. Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin are going to meet in Tehran from November to December of 1943 to discuss what's going to happen after Germany falls and after the war ends. Okay, in order to make this happen, though, they understand that they're going to have to go back in and get France. Okay, so the big three, that's what these guys were nicknamed, ultimately decide there needs to be an assault on France so that way they can drive the Germans out of there. And they're going to then come back, this is going to be done across the English Channel, and an invasion of Normandy is going to take place as a result of this. Sorry, I can't talk real quick. Okay, so basically, northern France is heavily fortified by the Germans, but we notice weaknesses in their defenses. So from across the English Channel, the Allies are going to come from over there in a multi-pronged attack, invade Normandy, that northern part of France, and then slowly work their way down to Paris, and then also start working their way east towards Germany. Okay, General Eisenhower, the guy I mentioned before, he is going to be left in charge of the attack and planning the attack. Again, the plans for this attack start taking form in December of 1943. By June of 1944, the attack is ready to go. All the men have been trained, and all the men are in Britain ready to go for this. The initial attack was going to take place on June the 5th of 1944. However, there was a series of rainstorms that night that would prohibit the attack from being as effective as we wanted it, so we stood down for 24 hours. Okay, Eisenhower designed the D-Day invasion that takes place June the 6th to be a sea, air, and land assault, so the weather had to be good. Okay, this became the largest amphibious assault in history. Amphibious basically means you come up from the water and you go on land. Okay, and this assault opened up a new front in Europe at very deadly cost, though. 4,000 Allied troops were killed on that single day alone. 9,000 Germans were killed on that day. Here you can see the D-Day landings, a series of beaches here in northern France. After coming across the English Channel, you had different sectors, named for these beaches. And the most famous one of which is the Omaha Beach, as it is depicted within Saving Private Ryan, which you probably have seen that before. If not, it's going to be on my list of recommended movies. But basically, these people came up into a barrage of gunfire. The very, very, very many people on the first wave were killed. I actually knew a guy that was a friend of my grandfather's on my mom's side that took part in D-Day. He refused to talk about very much about it, other than the fact that he was not part of the first wave. But the things that he saw on the beach as soon as he got there shook him until the day he died. So anyway, various violent things that happened on D-Day resulted in ultimately the United States taking the beach and then starting to make their way in, the United States and allies, starting to make their way into France from there. Here you can see a photo taken. This is not of the first wave because it looks like all these people are already on the beach. But what these were amphibious vehicles. Basically, they had boats that could also drive on land, kind of like a duck. If you've ever seen the ducks that go from land to water and then back onto land. But they had a gate in the front that would drop down and let the soldiers off as they reached land. And many people, that gate provided some protection from the bullets. As soon as the gates fell on the people as they made the first assault, a lot of those people just absolutely slaughtered whenever that gate fell. After D-Day, the Allies began spreading out into France. The goal again, get back Paris and then go back into Germany and force the Germans back into Germany. After the initial assault on France, operations are mostly under the charge of General George S. Patton, who led his campaign across the French countryside in order to take back French towns and then eventually go into Paris. Eventually, he is going to liberate Paris in August 1944. Okay, it is also at this point in time here on the home front, while we were having success in taking out Italy and then recapturing France, we know that we still have to go in and capture Germany because the objective here is an unconditional surrender of Germany. So at this point in time, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States since 1933, is going to run for election for the fourth time, or re-election for the fourth time. Okay, if he had completed it, he would have served 16 years in the White House at that point in time. Up to this point in time, of course, he has served 12. Served 11. As you know, you can no longer do that. Thanks to, excuse me, I believe it was the 22nd Amendment that said that. So you could have 2 terms of 4 years thereafter. His vice president that he selects for this fourth term is a relatively unknown senator that, I say unknown, he is known for having people actually prove to him what they are saying, being very conscientious with spending, things of that sort, and very interested in the military. This senator's name is Harry S. Truman. He is going to be selected because he has very few political enemies, and also was seen as somebody that could potentially step up as a fortified leader if something were to happen to Roosevelt. Well, FDR is in extremely poor health. Truman is kept largely away from Roosevelt because they did not want him to know too much about the war. And Truman, of course, had mentioned in his diary that he was fairly bored with the vice presidency up to this point in time, other than looking into military spending. But they knew the reason why Truman was selected and FDR is still allowed to run for president is because the Allies knew that, or not the Allies, sorry, I'm just getting crossed up all over the place here. The Democratic Party knew if FDR does not run for the Democratic nomination, they're not probably going to win the election. Okay, and he runs against a guy named Thomas Dewey, who was from New York, a Republican, but Roosevelt adopts the same mindset that Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War. You don't want to change a horse mid-race. So anyway, FDR is allowed to run one more time and actually is going to win the election in 1944 with Truman as his vice president. Okay, and of course is the new pick for vice president. Okay, also along this point in time, after the election in November of 1944, in which Truman and Roosevelt are elected to the presidency, Roosevelt is elected to the presidency with Truman as his vice president, Hitler is going to push for one final offensive in December of 1944 in order to break through the Allied lines and then recapture land that had once been held by the Germans. Well, this final assault took a little over a month, and it ultimately failed. Okay, the battle became known as the Battle of the Bulge because you can see the borders of Germany here. These are the previous lines. Basically, the Allies held all lands behind this line towards Germany. Well, here in the Ardennes forests, the Germans are actually going to make an assault on the American lines as well as the Allied lines, and they're going to push the Americans back into Belgium pretty significantly. However, the Americans were able to hold their ground once they pushed back just a little bit, and then are able to overcome this and eventually push the Germans back into Germany. The reason why it becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge is because this line bulged, but it did not break. Okay, so once this fighting ends, Germany is going to wind up being on defense for the remainder of the war. The Battle of the Bulge sees some very cold, intense fighting throughout the course of the battle. You can see here the amount of snow on the trees, as well as a man here ducking down behind the trees during the battle, looking for enemies. But the thing is, there was a lot of artillery used from this, and there are some stories about the trees were so frozen that once the intense heat of the artillery that hit them hit the trees would shatter outwards, even if they had not been hit directly by a projectile. And these trees wound up giving several men shrapnel wounds from splinters from the trees. Okay, so not a very pleasant place to be and not a very pleasant place to serve. Obviously, no war is, but some pretty brutal fighting here because the Germans knew if they lost this, they have to defend their homeland thereafter. So as Allies pushed in from Poland into Poland from the east and Germany from the west, and what that means is the Russians have pushed in through Poland, and the Americans, the British, and the French have pushed in from the west through Germany. It became very clear that Hitler had been up to something behind these enemy lines. Okay, and that's something that he had been up to. We had heard in our military intelligence, but we had a hard time believing that this was actually possible, and we dismissed it as rumors and had not given much thought to this. Okay, what wound up happening is there was an extermination of Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses. And Jehovah's misspelled, I apologize for that, it should be an H on there, among many other groups. And whenever I say there had been an extermination of them, basically it was a systematic systematic death. Okay, so these individuals are targeted for their beliefs or for their race. And again, Hitler originally went after Jewish folks after reading a pamphlet on anti-Semitism, and he said, yes, all the problems that I've ever had in my life were because a group of Jewish people are behind them. So he embraced that, but he also wanted to drive out these other minority communities and unwanted communities that he wanted or did not want within Germany. So anyway, they were all targeted. They are rounded up. Of course, they are tattooed with numbers and registered. And then basically they're used as slave labor, or some of them were immediately murdered. Okay, and of course you all know the various stories about how this would happen. Again, I don't go into too much detail on the Holocaust, which is what this is all part of, because that is more of a world history aspect of it. But in terms of American history, what you need to know, some of the soldiers that find these camps participated in the D-Day landings, and after seeing the 9,000 bodies of men on the shores as they came across and facing a heavy barrage of gunfire, they said that going in and liberating camps where people were locked up and coming up to them pleading for them to help them because they were starving and or scared, they said that was harder mentally than it was to stare down death on D-Day. And also, they saw some very horrific things involving children. There were stories about entire railroad cars being full of bodies that they would open up. They said the stench is just absolutely awful from the amount of death and unsanitary conditions these people were put through. Now, like I said, we had known that Hitler was targeting Jewish folks and making life pretty miserable for them, but we did not know that he was actually killing them. We figured it was kind of a similar situation to the United States that had the Japanese internment camps. We thought it was something similar to that. Okay, and the reason for this, like I said, is because the world had never seen anything this systematic and this graphic before. We'd had other genocides, but they were not, I guess, as concentrated as the Holocaust was in terms of, we are going to round these people up and we are going to assure that this group dies and this group is going to go and work until they are starved to death. Okay. One of the things that they did is the people of Germany knew this stuff was going on, but they did nothing. Well, Dwight D. Eisenhower, whenever he gets into the first camp, he says those in the town around here are to be rounded up They're going to come up here before this place is cleaned up, and they're going to see what their German dictator had done to all these Jewish folks. This is done to turn them against Hitler and turn people against the Nazi regime, and see that they needed to have an overthrown government and something else to replace it with. Okay, so there are multiple stories about people denying that this had happened and saying that it's not possible, our government could not do this. And they went in through these camps and quickly had their minds changed. Okay, so furthermore, in the spring of 1945, as the war is wrapping up in Europe and in the Pacific, you're going to see that Franklin Roosevelt is not going to make it out of the war. Okay, he actually died less than a month before victory is declared in Europe. Okay, on April 12, 1945, Roosevelt was actually posing for a painting that was being done of him at a rehab facility in Warm Springs, Georgia, a place that he frequented on vacation. He is actually down there with his mistress. But as this painting is being done of Roosevelt, who I'd mentioned is in poor health, he kind of sits up in his wheelchair and he says, "I have a terrific headache." And then he slumped forward and was taken into a room at Warm Springs, where he was later pronounced dead that day from a cerebral hemorrhage or a massive brain bleed. His blood pressure had risen extremely high, and this is what had eventually contributed to his death. Later that afternoon, Truman is at work at his desk. They go into Truman's office and they say, "President Roosevelt has died. You need to prepare to be sworn in as President of the United States." Okay, once Truman is sworn in, a couple things happen. His first order of business, he had other people waiting to talk to him, but he wanted to go and consult Mrs. Roosevelt, who was the most popular first lady pretty much of all time at that point in time. He goes up to console Mrs. Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt says, she's obviously a little bit upset, but Truman says, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And she says, "No. Is there anything I can do for you? Because you're the one that's in trouble now." Which kind of took a little bit of the tension out of the situation, but made Truman realize, hey, I am the guy now. After, almost 13 years of the same president, now I am the guy. So Truman is then taken to the side. He is briefed on what is going on the European front, things that he probably had a good idea about at that point in time as well. But first piece of information he is given, the Soviets are in Germany and closing in on Berlin. So he knew that the Germans were being overrun in their own country. The Soviet Union was approaching from the east, and the Allies were approaching from the west. And they said that the Soviet Union may wind up getting the overall victory in this, or securing the victory for this, which Truman said was fine because the Soviet Union had been the ones that had lost so many people. So he said that's fine if they overrun Berlin. However, he is also later taken into another room, and they say, "What you're about to hear, you cannot tell anybody about." And he is told about a top secret project that was almost ready to be tested to see if this project was ready to go. And of course, this came from the Manhattan Project. And of course, I'm referring to the atomic weapons that were developed during that. Okay, so more on that later on. A few days later, on April 29th, 1945, Hitler is going to realize, after a very heated meeting with his generals, that there is no hope of him winning this war, that he is surrounded, and that there's just absolutely no way that he can overcome this or even evacuate. So Hitler is going to write a farewell speech to the German people. He is going to read it in a radio address, and he is going to begin making preparations to get married that day. Okay, and winds up actually marrying in his Fuhrer bunker, which is an underground bunker that he was staying in with his top commanders. That excuse me, he just lost my train of thought. He is going to not be leaving Germany. He is going to stay there until this all falls. But however, he had already noted to other people, if something should happen to me, I want to make sure that my body is burned, soak it in gasoline once I'm dead, and make sure that nobody can get a hold of this. I don't want to be mutilated like Mussolini was. Hitler, the next day, committed suicide by shooting himself in the temple, as well as biting down simultaneously on a cyanide capsule. His wife, Eva Braun, who he had married the day before, also takes a cyanide capsule and commits suicide. one of his lieutenants that was down there with his wife and children. They all committed suicide as well. The children were actually fed or actually given a toxic mixture to drink. And I believe there was like 6 kids that wound up dying as a result of this as well. Hitler, however, once Hitler commits suicide, somebody heard the shot. They go in and check on Hitler, discover that he is in fact dead. So they follow orders to take his body up. They put him into a bomb crater, douse it with gasoline, and burned it in order to prevent Hitler from being identified and later taken and put on display someplace. Well, the problem was Hitler's body was, as a matter of fact, discovered, and they did not know it was him at the time. They had a pretty good idea of who it was going to be. But anyway, the Soviet Union wound up taking these bones, and supposedly they're in a museum, or not a museum, but they're supposedly in storage over there someplace now. But anyway, once Hitler dies, it is going to fall to other people in command of the Nazi army as well as the German people that they are going to have to end the war. So that is where we are going to go, and we're going to end the war in the war in Europe right now, and we will end the war in the Pacific as well. So more on this here in just a second with the final section of this chapter's